Hi everyone, today we will be reading this book Camel in the Sun. Camel in the Sun by Griffin on Dash Day and pictures by Linda Wolfsgruber. In the lands east of the Red Sea, past the mountains of Hijaz, there was a camel. It had worked all its life for a merchant Halim, carrying goods back and forth across the desert. It often walked all the way from Al Hassa oasis to the sea at Jeddah. The old camel carried large bundles filled with spices, dates, incense, silk, silver, and wool. Before each journey, its owner would make it kneel so he could climb on its back and settle on top of the bundles. Then the camel would stand and start to work. Okay, here's the camel kneeling so that the owner can be on it. The camel climbed the steep sand dunes and walked along the tops of them and then lumbered down their other side, almost tumbling over and spilling everything on the flat stretches of the desert. When nightfall was approaching, the man always yelled at the camel to run so he could reach the place where he'd sell his goods as fast as possible. They rarely stopped to rest. The camel's whole life was spent struggling across the oceans of sand. By the time it arrived at their destination, it would stand breathing in and out noisily with foams gathering around its mouth. Then it would wait patiently in the sun while its owner climbed down and walked over to the shade to sit and talk business with other merchants. Poor, tired camel. One day, suddenly, after years of walking in the burning sun over the desert's sandy waves, the camel felt water rising in its eyes. Oh, he's crying. At first, it didn't know what was happening. The camel thought perhaps its eyes were hurting from the wind blowing sand in its face. But it was tears that were filling its eyes. The camel stood still and breathed out a long sigh. The owner climbed off its back and stared at the camel. When he saw that the camel was just tired and sad, he said, "The slower you walk, the longer till you drink water." And he climbed up again. Such a wicked man. The old camel never showed its sadness to Halim again. In the evening, though, when Halim had fallen asleep among the bundles, the camel sighed under the huge night sky. It walked along, dragging its nose string across the land, biting its lip and looking up at the stars. It was lonely now as it thought that there was no one it could tell about its long life of suffering and hard work. Night. Wait. And so, for the next few months, the camel continued walking in the hot sun, but at night it drifted away like a boat, often with the bundle still tied to its back, and sank behind a sand dune and sighed to itself until morning. As for Halim, he would sleep soundly, and during the day he'd ride on the camel's back as if he were floating over the desert on a bundle of valuable goods under which there was no camel. One day they approached the outskirts of Medina. Medina was a beautiful city with 100 gardens, and it was said that the Prophet lived there. The merchant was looking forward to resting there before traveling on south of Najran. So it's the illustration of the beautiful city of Medina with the green domes. They passed through the narrow city gate and entered a garden where some people were gathered in the shade of tall palm trees. Halim tied the camel to a post in the blazing sun. Then he walked over to the shade and sat down. He drank water, ate some dates, and walked business with other merchants. When he was done, he piled up a pillow of sand and lay down and fell asleep in the shade. The camel stood still alone with the bundles on its back. A few hours passed. It stood patiently in the hot sun. The Prophet, may peace and salutations be upon him, who was indeed living in Medina, was out for a walk that afternoon and he entered the garden. He looked over and saw the merchant resting in the shade of the trees. And then he turned and saw the camel standing in the hot sun. He saw how the camel was tied to a post, barely able to stand, looking sad. It was the rope was too tired to which the camel was tied. The Prophet crossed into the bright sunlight and walked straight up and hugged the camel's neck, pressing his face against its long bony face. He stared into the camel's surprised black eyes and then offered his shoulder for support. The camel leaned heavily on the Prophet's shoulder and burst into tears. It heaved with long sobs of unhappiness. Its whole body shook the way animals shake when they cry in secret. And then something happened. The tears falling from the camel's eyes fell on the sand and sank down, and somehow they sifted into Halim's stream, and soon Halim began to see through the camel's eye. Dreaming there in the cool shade, Halim felt his heart ache with sadness. He saw for the first time how hot and tired the camel was, and he felt as the camel felt that he had led a lifetime of pain and loneliness. He lay there and wept in his dream into his pillow of sand while the camel cried against the shoulder of the Prophet. When the camel had finally finished crying, the Prophet, may peace and salutations be upon him, stood back and looked over at the sleeping man who was still crying. Are you the camel's owner? He asked. Messenger of God, I, answered the man from where he lay still, half asleep under the tree. He was about to speak when a wave of sadness came over him again, and he lost his voice and was unable to say anything else. Can can't you see that the camel is sad? Said the Prophet. May peace and salutations be upon him. The man could find no words. Finally, the Prophet turned and slowly walked away. Halim felt his face grow hotter and hotter. He was feverish. He felt as though the sun's flame, as sharp as pineapple leaves, were falling onto his face. He sat up. He saw the camel staring after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Halim could still feel tears on his face. He walked over and untied the camel, then reached up and stroked its neck and stood quietly beside it. Then he gave the camel water and guided it gently into the shades of the tree. We will rest a while before we go on, he said softly. There is no need to hurry. So, this book was inspired by the a booklet entitled Animal Welfare in Islamic Law, and it's basically an inspiration that comes from hadith. The Prophet discovered an overworked and starving camel and immediately instructed its owner to care for it properly. The message was direct and clear how the Prophet dealt so openly and compassionately with the situation, first comforting the suffering animals and then enlightening the owner, remained powerful and unforgettable. The camel's owner is compelled to change and suddenly faces a crucial moment in his life. Perhaps he is like most of us who have somewhere in life left a camel in the sun. Whatever that camel may be, maybe it is even part of ourselves. It's a very significant narrative to some of the readers, and it comes from Hadith. A very beautiful book that we find. I hope you all like it. Thank you. Bye.